In the middle of the Great Depression, some American families survived entire winters on dinners that cost less than a single coin. These were not restaurant meals or famous recipes printed in glossy cookbooks. They were desperate creations made in tiny kitchens by exhausted parents trying to stretch flour, potatoes, onions, and scraps of meat far enough to feed hungry children another night. Many of these dishes used only 3 ingredients, yet they kept millions alive during one of the darkest economic collapses in American history. Today, most people have never heard of them. Some disappeared because families were ashamed of poverty. Others vanished as modern convenience foods replaced traditional survival cooking. But hidden inside these forgotten meals is a story about endurance, sacrifice, and the frightening reality of how ordinary Americans survived when money disappeared almost overnight. By the end of this video, you will see 10 Depression-era dinners that sound unbelievable today, yet once meant the difference between hunger and survival. Part 01: Potato and Onion Skillet. During the worst years of the Great Depression, potatoes and onions became the backbone of survival cooking across America. They were cheap, filling, and available almost everywhere, even when grocery shelves looked empty and families had only a few cents left to spend. In many working-class homes, this simple skillet dinner appeared several nights each week because it could feed an entire family using only 3 ingredients: potatoes, onions, and lard or butter. The meal usually began with thin slices of potato dropped into a hot cast-iron pan. Onions followed soon after, slowly softening as the smell filled tiny kitchens during cold evenings. Families often waited anxiously around the stove because the sizzling sound alone could make an empty stomach feel hopeful. There was no expensive seasoning, no cheese, and no meat for most households. The flavor came entirely from browned onions and crispy potato edges cooked over low heat. Many children who grew up during the 1930s later remembered this dinner with mixed emotions. Some described it as comforting because it meant they would not go to bed hungry. Others remembered how often it appeared on the table when money completely disappeared. In farming communities, the ingredients sometimes came directly from backyard gardens, making the dish even more important during harsh winters. Today, a potato and onion skillet may sound painfully simple, but during the Great Depression, this humble 3-ingredient dinner represented survival, resourcefulness, and the determination of American families refusing to surrender to hunger. Part 02: Creamed Peas on Toast. For many struggling families during the Great Depression, dinner depended entirely on whatever remained in the pantry at the end of the week. One forgotten meal that appeared across countless American tables was creamed peas on toast, a surprisingly filling dish made with only peas, milk, and stale bread. It was inexpensive, quick to prepare, and capable of stretching small amounts of food into a warm evening meal for several people. The dish often began with canned peas because they were cheap and lasted for months without spoiling. Mothers poured the peas into a saucepan with milk, allowing the mixture to thicken slowly over heat. Once it became creamy enough, the mixture was spooned over slices of toasted bread that had usually become too stale to eat normally. Nothing was wasted during the Depression. Bread that modern families might throw away became the foundation of survival dinners. Children sometimes complained about the soft texture and plain taste, but many parents viewed the meal differently. To them, a hot plate of food meant another successful night of keeping the family fed despite unemployment, shrinking paychecks, and empty cupboards. In crowded city apartments, this dinner became especially common because it required no oven, little fuel, and almost no preparation time. Although creamed peas on toast disappeared from most modern kitchens, it once represented practical Depression-era cooking at its most resourceful. Every spoonful reflected a time when Americans learned to transform the cheapest pantry ingredients into meals that could comfort exhausted families facing uncertainty every single day. Part 03: Cornbread and Milk Supper. Long before processed frozen dinners filled American grocery stores, many rural families survived on meals so simple that modern generations would barely recognize them as dinner. One of the most common was cornbread and milk supper, a Depression-era meal built from only cornbread, milk, and a small amount of butter or bacon grease. It appeared constantly across the South and Appalachian regions because the ingredients were inexpensive, filling, and usually available even during severe financial hardship. Fresh cornbread was often baked early in the morning using cheap cornmeal that families purchased in large sacks. By evening, leftover pieces were broken into bowls and covered with warm milk. If the household could spare it, a little butter or bacon grease was added for extra flavor and calories. The result was soft, warm, and surprisingly comforting after long days of physical labor or standing in unemployment lines. For struggling farming families, this meal carried emotional importance beyond its simplicity. Cornmeal could last for weeks, milk often came from family cows, and the dinner required almost no expensive ingredients. During harsh winters, it became a dependable source of warmth when cupboards looked dangerously empty. Older Americans who lived through the Depression later recalled hearing spoons scrape empty bowls because nobody wanted to waste even a single bite. Today, many people would view cornbread and milk as little more than a side dish or snack. During the 1930s, however, it became proof that families could survive difficult times by relying on basic ingredients, tradition, and the determination to make something nourishing from almost nothing at all. Part 04: Fried Cabbage and Noodles. During the Great Depression, cabbage became one of the most valuable vegetables in America because it was cheap, lasted for weeks without spoiling, and could feed large families with very little money. Combined with simple egg noodles and a small amount of butter or grease, it created a filling dinner that appeared in kitchens across immigrant neighborhoods, farming towns, and crowded city apartments struggling through economic collapse. The meal began with chopped cabbage slowly frying in a cast-iron skillet until the edges softened and turned slightly golden. Once the cabbage released its natural sweetness, cooked noodles were added directly into the pan. Butter, bacon grease, or whatever cooking fat remained in the kitchen tied everything together. The smell alone often brought hungry children into the kitchen before supper was even ready. For Eastern European immigrant families especially, fried cabbage and noodles carried memories of older traditions brought from overseas long before the Depression began. During hard times, these recipes became survival tools passed between generations. The ingredients were inexpensive enough that even families facing unemployment could usually manage to prepare the dish at least once each week. Many people later remembered the meal as both comforting and repetitive because it appeared so often during periods of poverty. Yet it solved a dangerous problem facing millions of Americans during the 1930s: how to create enough food to satisfy an entire household using almost nothing from the pantry. Today, fried cabbage and noodles may seem plain compared to modern dinners, but during the Depression, this humble three-ingredient meal represented endurance, family tradition, and the ability to survive another difficult night without going hungry. Part 05: Navy Beans with Salt Pork. Few foods were more closely connected to Depression-era survival than navy beans. Cheap, filling, and capable of feeding entire families for days, they became a lifeline for millions of struggling Americans during the 1930s. When combined with small pieces of salt pork and slow-cooked in water for hours, these simple beans transformed into one of the most common three-ingredient dinners of the Great Depression. Large bags of dried beans were affordable even for families living on almost nothing. Mothers soaked them overnight so they would soften faster while cooking the next day. A small chunk of salt pork, sometimes no larger than a child's hand, flavored the entire pot. Even though meat was scarce and expensive, a little pork fat could make plain beans taste rich enough to satisfy exhausted workers and hungry children alike. The meal often simmered for most of the afternoon, filling homes with a warm smell that many Depression survivors never forgot. In small apartments and rural farmhouses alike, navy beans became dependable because they stretched farther than almost any other food available at the time. Leftovers were rarely wasted. Families reheated the beans for lunch or supper again the following day. For many Americans, this dish represented more than cheap food. It symbolized survival through patience, planning, and necessity. Cooking dried beans required time, but time was one thing unemployed families often had in abundance during the economic collapse. Today, navy beans with salt pork may sound old-fashioned, yet during the Great Depression, this modest dinner kept countless Americans alive when jobs disappeared, wages collapsed, and every penny determined whether a family ate or went hungry that night. Part 06: Tomato Gravy over Bread. During the Great Depression, Many American families learned how to turn the simplest pantry ingredients into meals that could quiet hunger for an entire evening. One of the most forgotten examples was tomato gravy over bread, a humble Southern dinner made with canned tomatoes, flour, and slices of stale bread. Although it sounded simple, this dish became a survival meal in homes where meat, fresh vegetables, and expensive groceries were completely out of reach. The preparation required almost nothing. Tomatoes were poured into a hot skillet and slowly cooked down while flour thickened the mixture into a rich gravy. Once the sauce became smooth enough, it was spooned generously over old bread that had hardened with age. During the Depression, stale bread was never wasted because every crumb mattered when money was scarce and families feared the next trip to the grocery store. In many rural communities, tomato gravy became especially important during winter months when gardens stopped producing fresh food. Canned tomatoes stored from previous harvests often provided one of the few remaining sources of flavor in struggling households. Parents served the meal hot because warmth alone made difficult evenings feel slightly more bearable for children sitting around crowded kitchen tables. Many Americans later remembered tomato gravy with deep nostalgia because it reflected the determination of families who refused to waste anything. It was not elegant cooking, and nobody viewed it as luxury food. Still, it offered comfort during a frightening economic disaster that reshaped daily life across the country. Today, most people have never tasted tomato gravy over bread. Yet for countless Depression-era families, this simple 3-ingredient supper once meant survival, warmth, and another night without hunger. Part 07: Hot Dog Rice Skillet. During the harsh years of the Great Depression, families often relied on whatever inexpensive ingredients could stretch across multiple meals. One unexpected combination that became surprisingly common was hot dog rice skillet, a simple dinner made with rice, sliced hot dogs, and a small amount of onion or leftover fat for flavor. It was never considered fancy, but it was practical, filling, and affordable enough to appear in many working-class homes. Rice was one of the cheapest staples available in grocery stores, and it could be cooked in large quantities to feed an entire family. Hot dogs, even though considered a processed meat, were often one of the few affordable protein sources that parents could manage on tight budgets. When sliced and cooked together in a single pan, the ingredients created a warm, hearty meal that helped stretch limited resources across several days. The preparation was simple. Rice was boiled until soft, then added to a skillet where hot dogs and onions were lightly fried. The mixture absorbed whatever small amount of fat was available, giving it a stronger flavor than its basic ingredients suggested. For many children, this dinner became a familiar part of weekly survival eating. In crowded industrial cities, this dish was especially common among families facing unstable work and rising food prices. It required almost no skill, minimal fuel, and very little money, making it ideal for households struggling to maintain stability. Today, hot dog rice skillet may seem like an unusual combination, but during the Great Depression, it represented resourcefulness under pressure, proving how ordinary ingredients could be transformed into enough food to keep families going through some of the most difficult years in American history. Part 08: SOS Creamed Beef on Toast. During the Great Depression, some of the most remembered survival meals came from military influence and leftover cooking traditions. One of the most iconic examples was SOS Creamed Beef on Toast, a dish made with ground beef, flour, milk, and bread. It was inexpensive, easy to prepare, and capable of feeding several people using very small amounts of meat. The dish began by browning a small portion of ground beef in a pan. Flour was added to create a thick base, followed by milk to form a creamy gravy. The mixture was then poured over slices of toast, usually made from older bread that had already lost its softness. In many households, this meal appeared during evenings when money was almost completely gone and the pantry offered little else. Families appreciated it because even a small amount of meat could be stretched across an entire meal. The creamy texture and warm gravy made it feel more filling than the ingredients suggested. In cities where unemployment was high, SOS creamed beef became a practical answer to the question of how to feed multiple people with almost nothing. The meal carried different names depending on region and household, but its purpose remained the same: survival through simplicity. It required no expensive spices, no special equipment, and very little cooking time. For families exhausted by economic uncertainty, that mattered more than taste. Today, SOS creamed beef on toast is often remembered as a military comfort food, but during the Great Depression it was far more than that. It was a dependable dinner that helped countless American families endure nights of hunger, uncertainty, and financial collapse. Part 09: Potato Soup with Crackers. In many Depression-era homes, the most dependable meals were the ones that could be stretched endlessly with water and patience. Potato soup with crackers became one of those quiet survival dishes, built from only potatoes, water or milk, and a handful of saltine crackers. It was simple, inexpensive, and found in both rural kitchens and crowded city apartments where food shortages were a daily concern. The process was straightforward. Potatoes were peeled, chopped, and boiled until they broke down into a soft, thick base. In more fortunate households, a splash of milk was added to give it a richer texture, but many families relied only on water and a pinch of salt. The soup was rarely thick with ingredients, yet it provided warmth that mattered far more than appearance. Crackers were served alongside or crumbled directly into the bowl to create bulk. They softened quickly, turning the thin soup into something that felt more substantial. Nothing was wasted. Even broken crackers at the bottom of a tin box were saved for meals like this. For many families, this dish appeared during the hardest weeks when wages stopped completely or work simply disappeared. It was not memorable for its flavor, but for its reliability. A single pot could stretch across multiple meals, making it a practical answer to hunger when options were nearly gone. Today, potato soup with crackers may seem too plain to notice, but during the Great Depression it carried a deeper meaning. It represented endurance in its simplest form, showing how families survived long stretches of hardship using only what they had left in their kitchens. Part 10: Fried Cornmeal Mush. In the final years of the Great Depression, when many families had already exhausted every possible way to stretch their food budgets, fried cornmeal mush became one of the most dependable survival dinners in America. Made from only cornmeal, water, and a small amount of salt or fat, it was cheap, filling, and easy to prepare even in homes with almost empty cupboards. The preparation began by slowly cooking cornmeal in boiling water until it thickened into a dense porridge. This mixture was poured into pans and left to cool, where it hardened into a firm loaf that could be sliced and saved for later meals. When hunger returned, the slices were fried in a pan until the outside became crisp while the inside remained soft. Families often ate it at breakfast, lunch, or dinner depending on what was available. Some households served it with a drizzle of syrup if they could afford it, but during the harshest periods it was eaten plain. Even without flavor enhancements, it provided the calories needed to keep people going through physically demanding days. In rural communities, cornmeal mush had deep roots long before the Depression, but economic collapse brought it back as a necessity rather than tradition. It required almost no money, very little fuel, and could be made in large batches to last for days. Today, fried cornmeal mush is rarely seen on modern tables, but during the Great Depression, it represented the final layer of survival cooking. It was a meal born not from choice, but from endurance, showing how families held on through one of the most difficult economic periods in American history. These meals were never created for comfort or choice. They existed because millions of American families were forced to rebuild daily life around scarcity, uncertainty, and empty kitchens. Each dish you have seen today reflects a time when survival depended on creativity rather than abundance, and when a single pot could decide how a family endured another night. What feels simple or unusual now once carried real weight at the dinner table. These recipes are reminders that history is not only found in major events, but also in what ordinary people ate when everything else disappeared. If these forgotten Depression-era dinners surprised you, there are many more hidden survival stories waiting to be uncovered from the same era. Subscribe to the channel for more lost recipes, forgotten food histories, and the untold meals that shaped American life during its most difficult years.